Would take out your Bibles and you can stick a finger in Genesis as we are going to be orbiting in and around that area for a little while. So, just in the way of background, so with Will, what he's been preaching through for the past several weeks is, as you're aware, we've been working our way through Genesis. And I thought when he announced that, that's really exciting because all too often, as New Covenant believers, we can look at the Old Testament and think, well, how does this apply to us? Why is this relevant to me on this side of the cross? And so we have that's we've been working through. And then last week, Chris went through the need to hold fast to the gospel. And as I was thinking what to do here, what I like to do is kind of keep some continuity with what we've been talking about. And so we're going to do something a little bit different this morning and next week. Uh, as we as we look at the text, we're going to be looking at some aspects of the gospel in the Old Testament in a way that hopefully is helpful to you and that hopefully helps put the Old Testament in a little bit of a clearer context. So this is going to be maybe a little bit different than a typical sermon that you would hear at Berean, because instead of taking one specific text and working through that, what we're going to be doing is zooming up to about a 30,000 foot view, and we're going to be looking at the whole of the book of Genesis and making some observations about it, and hopefully in a way that is helpful as we think about that. I will tell you up front that as we go through this, this is going to assume a little bit of a working understanding of the book of Genesis. So if maybe you're not as familiar with the book of Genesis, as I'm talking through it and talking about some of the themes that go through it, I hope that if you're saying I'm a little bit rusty on my Old Testament, that this then helps encourage you as you go back to it, just some things to keep in mind as we're working through it. So we'll be looking at that again, 30,000 foot view. I going to be looking at the book as a whole, but we'll see what happens here. So let's go ahead and pray and jump right in. Heavenly Father, we thank you for your word. We thank you for the book that you have given us in the Bible, and that we can look at it and we can see your truth and we can be challenged by it, and we can live in a way that reflects the truths that you have given us. So I pray that you would help us this hour. Teach us, I pray, through the wisdom and guidance of your Spirit. I ask these things in Christ's name. Amen. All right, so looking at the Old Testament as a whole. So let's start there, and then we're going to zoom in into the book of Genesis. So take your lens and just move way, way back. So we're looking at the Old Testament as a whole. What we're talking about when we talk about the Old Testament is a fairly major issue that's often an issue of debate and discussion within the evangelical world. Is the Old Testament relevant to the believer today? And then the follow-on question is, if so, how? And it's my hope as we've been going through Genesis that you've been starting to see, yes, the Old Testament is incredibly relevant to how we live our lives now. And yet, even as we look through the New Testament, as we read that, we can see a number of different places where we see the import of the Old Testament. So, for instance, we could look at Luke chapter 24, verses 13 through 27, a passage that you're probably familiar with. So here's Jesus after the resurrection, and he appears to two of his disciples, which are walking on the road to Emmaus. So they're walking to Emmaus. They're going about 7 miles away from Jerusalem, verse 14, and they were talking with each other about all these things that had taken place. And while they were talking and discussing, Jesus himself approached and began traveling with them, but their eyes were prevented from recognizing him. And he said to them, "What are these words that you are exchanging with one another as you are walking?" And they stood still looking sad. One of them, named Cleopas, answered and said to him, "Are you the only one visiting Jerusalem and unaware of the things which have happened here in these days?" And he said to them, "What things?" And they said to him, "The things about Jesus the Nazarene, who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word in the sight of God and all the people, and how the chief priests and the rulers delivered him to the sentence of death and crucified him. But we were hoping that it was he who was going to redeem Israel. Indeed, beside all this, this is the third day since these things happened, but some women among us amazed us. They went to the tomb early in the morning, did not find his body. They came, saying that they also had seen a vision of angels who said that he was alive. Some who went with us went to the tomb and found it just exactly as the women had also said, but him they did not see." Now look at Jesus' response. One of the things that's always interesting to me in this passage is Jesus does not go, "Hey guys, look, it's me." Instead, what does he do? Take a look at verse 25. "And he, Jesus, said to them, 'O foolish men, and slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Was it not necessary for the Christ to suffer these things and to enter into his glory?' Then, beginning with Moses and with all the prophets, he explained to them all the things concerning himself in all the scriptures." So here's Jesus saying, you don't understand what happened with the Messiah, with his death, burial, and resurrection, because you did not understand the Old Testament. Specifically, you did not understand the Old Testament prophets, as they're speaking of the Messiah and his glory. If we go down just a little bit later in the chapter, verse 44, when Jesus appears to his disciples, he says something very similar. "Now he, Jesus, said to them, 'These are my words which I spoke to you while I was still with you, that all the things which are written about me in the law of Moses and the prophets and the Psalms must be fulfilled.' Then," look what he does, "he opened their minds to understand the scriptures. And he said to them, 'Thus it is written that the Christ would suffer and rise again from the dead the third day, that repentance for the forgiveness of sins would be proclaimed in his name to all the nations, beginning from Jerusalem.'" So here again is Jesus saying, if you had understood the Old Testament properly, you would have been able to look at what happened with the Messiah, and you would have been able to see coherence between what's happening here with Jesus and what the Old Testament spoke of. So all the Old Testament texts Jesus brings out twice here are pointing forward to their fulfillment in Jesus. So just from that, we look at the Old Testament and say, well, there's definitely a relevance, certainly to the New Testament believer. But we see something similar in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 11. Here, Paul is speaking to the Corinthians, and he challenges them, describing the first part of the chapter. He describes what took place in the wilderness wanderings. "Our fathers passed under this cloud and passed through the sea and were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea, ate the same spiritual food, drank the same spiritual drink." And he goes and he describes some of the things that took place during the wilderness wanderings that we read about in the book of Exodus, the book of Numbers. Now, these things happened as examples for us so that we would not crave evil things as they also craved. "Don't be idolaters, as some of them were, as it is written. The people sat down to eat and drink and stood up to play. Don't let us act immorally, as some of them did, and 23,000 fell in one day. Don't let us test the Lord, as some of them did, and were destroyed by serpents. Nor grumble, as some of them did, and were destroyed by the destroyer." So he goes through and he takes these instances that took place in the Old Testament, and he says, you should learn from these. Why? Verse 11. "Now these things happened to them as an example, and they were written for our instruction, upon whom the ends of the ages have come." And so here we see Paul saying that what you read in the Old Testament, New Testament Corinthians, what you read in the Old Testament, you should be getting examples and instruction for as you live your lives here, specifically tying it to things like immorality, idolatry, testing the Lord, and complaining. He says you should be able to see that in the Old Testament. So Paul indicates that the Old Testament should be very important to the believer. And his point is that the Old Testament is to be a book that we look at and we get instruction from. Further, and I just make this observation here, for the first 20 years of the church, what Bible did believers have? They had the Old Testament. They didn't have the completed New Testament until something like 65 years after Jesus died, after Jesus' ministry. And so you look through the New Testament, and one of the things you'll notice is that the Old Testament is quoted fairly often, but it's always quoted as if you're supposed to be looking at the Old Testament and using it to inform your living today. And so we look at that and we say, well, how well do we do that? And I'd say probably for most of us, we would have to say, well, I'm maybe a lot stronger on the New Testament than I am at understanding and applying the Old Testament. I mean, you can see this a number of different ways. Probably the biggest way you can see this is in like children's Bible books, where you have a story that, here's David, here's Goliath, and what's the message? You need to be a David. You can kill the Goliaths in your life. Kind of a moralistic lesson that's sort of superficially pulled out, applied, and then they just move on. Well, today we are going to look at that question: how is the Old Testament relevant to the believer today? In a way that, again, is hopefully helpful. We're going to look at two passages in the Torah that illustrate the gospel. And we're going to do that today by looking broadly at the book of Genesis and looking at one of the major themes that runs through the book of Genesis, and then look at a prefiguring of the gospel that we find embedded in that. Okay, so that makes sense? That's where we're going. That's where we're at. Hopefully this is engaging. If you've always been like, Old Testament seems kind of dusty and I'm not sure how this works, hopefully this helps provide a little bit of clarity here. Okay, so let's talk about the book of Genesis. Little bit of background about that. Who is it written by? Well, we know it's written by Moses. And it's written about a little around 1405 BC. So we're talking again about 3,400 years old. And we have that written specifically as the Israelites are in the wilderness wanderings. Most likely, that's almost definitely when the book was written, along with the other 4 books of the Torah. Now, when we come to the book of Genesis, one of the questions that we should be asking is, what are the themes that run through the book? And if we were to just sit down right now and kind of brainstorm, I think some of the things that we might come up with are, well, a major theme is the theme of origins or beginnings. I mean, that's the name of the book, Genesis, how things begin. And so you have the beginning of things like a man, creation, sin, redemption. You have the beginning of God's covenant people. Then those are certainly true. Those are certainly major themes. And those are things that when we ask the question, how does Genesis relate to the believer? Those are things we tend to think about, and rightfully so. So we can look at things like creation. Okay, what does that mean? It means we are image bearers of God. We are responsible and commanded to display the glory of God in our lives. That ability to display the glory of God has been marred by sin. So we could look at that as a theme. We could look at sin and the fall. What went wrong? Everything was going so well for 2 whole chapters, and then it just blew up. Why did things go so wrong? And so we can look at Genesis 3, and we can see Adam and Eve, the serpent, disobeying God, the curse that is then a theme throughout the rest of the Bible. We could look at Noah and the flood, and we could see there a picture of salvation. We could see the judgment on sin. We could look at the Tower of Babel in chapter 11, and we could say, I guess, don't be proud and don't build really tall buildings. And then we move on from Babel and we come to Abraham and we see, okay, who's Abraham? He's the ancestor of the Messiah. All right, this is the one through whom redemption comes. So we can see those themes. But the problem is that only takes us to Genesis 12. If you look at Genesis, it's 50 chapters long. So what's going on the rest of the 38 chapters? What typically comes to mind when we're reading Genesis really only takes up about the first quarter of the book. So what does the rest of the book teach us? And that's tied to one of the major themes that drives the book of Genesis. Okay, so when we're looking at chapters 12 through 50, and we see Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, everything that takes place with them, we see the origin of God's covenant people. But think back to 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 11. If we're thinking about the Old Testament biblically, we should expect to see instruction, expect to see patterns that would inform our lives today. And so to understand the theme that's through Genesis that applies to us today, we need to look at Genesis' overall structure. So if you like structure, if you like literary structure, you're going to have a little bit of fun here. You take Genesis, you could break it up into four major components. Okay, there's we could call it a pre-Abrahamic introduction. That's the first 11 chapters. And there we see creation, we see Cain, we see Noah, we see Babel. See, all this stuff take place. We come to chapter 12, there are three major narrative cycles. So the first one is the narrative cycle that includes Abraham, and that takes us from chapter 12 all the way to chapter 25. So what's true about Abraham? And as we read, we see, so Abraham is called out of his land that he lived in. He's told to go to a land that he has never seen before that God is going to give him. And as we walk through Abraham's life, we see he goes, in chapter 12, goes down to Egypt and spends time in Egypt, not in the land that God has given him. In chapter 13, we see Lot and Abram, and they're in conflict because there's not enough space, and we have Lot who takes the good land, and Abram who gets the lesser land. We see Lot get captured. Abram rescues him. We see God's promise in chapter 15 to Abram that God is going to multiply him and increase him and give him the land. And he has this covenant event where God has Abraham cut the animals in half and separate them, literally cutting a covenant. And then we have God who then unilaterally walks through making a covenant by himself that he is going to give Abraham the land. As we continue on, chapter 16, we have Ishmael who is born. We have chapters 18 and 19. We have the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. Come to chapter 20, we have Abraham going back down to Gerar, which is at the southern end of Israel today. We have the offering of Isaac. We have his sending his servant to Nahor, which is about a 30-day trip to get a wife for Isaac. Sarah dies, and then he buys a small plot of land for her tomb. And that's basically Abraham's cycle. Second major cycle, narrative cycle, is Jacob. Jacob goes from chapter 27 all the way to chapter 35. So what's true about Jacob? Right off the bat, what does Jacob do? He tricks his brother, steals the blessing of the firstborn, and he's alienated from his family. He has to flee to Haran. That's a long way to the northeast. He runs for his life. He spends 20 years there with Laban. Laban cheats him multiple times, both with his wife and with his pay. Finally, he flees back. When he gets back into the land, He has this run-in with the city of Shechem where his sons kill all the men in Shechem, and Shechem gets really upset, and all the other nations get upset. And we have Jacob, who's alienated from the people in that particular region. And then we come to the last cycle, and that's the Joseph cycle. And Joseph takes us from chapter 37 all the way to chapter 50, the end of the book. And here, what do we have? We have Joseph, who has these dreams. His brothers hate him for it. He's alienated from his family. He's sold into slavery, goes down into Egypt. His brothers eventually come to him, and he reveals himself to them. Then what happens? The book concludes with the entire family together, but in Egypt, not in the promised land. So you might think, if you're looking at chapter 12 and then you think of those narrative cycles, it's interesting because you would look at that and say, for being about the promised land, and God has promised to give this land to Abram and his descendants, they sure don't spend a whole lot of time there. In fact, it seems like the majority of the time they're not in the promised land. And that's correct. There's a reason behind that. A major theme throughout the book of Genesis is the theme of alienation. All three narrative cycles deal with alienation, especially alienation from the promised land that God has given his people. God promised, you're going to inherit the land, and yet we have Abram, who keeps going out of the land, who never actually owns the land until the very end of his life, when he owns this little plot of land that he gives to his wife as her burial place. We have Isaac, which actually doesn't deal very prominently in the book. He only gets really one chapter to himself. Why is that? Because he spends the majority of his life in the promised land. We're going to come back to him in a moment. You have Jacob, you have Joseph, and all of them spend a tremendous amount of time outside the land. Okay, so let's back up to Genesis, chapter 3. What do we have there? Here's man who has been placed in the creation, and what happens? Man sins. And what happens? Man is alienated from God. He is kicked out of the Garden of Eden. So man is alienated from God. Then we come to Genesis chapter 4. We have Cain, who is further alienated because he kills Abel. And so he's kicked out. We have Noah, who is alienated in a world of evil. He's the only righteous man in a world of evil. We have Babel, where man is alienated from each other because he can't speak to each other. But the thing that's interesting as you're looking through those accounts is that you routinely see man is alienated and yet God is faithful. So for instance, Adam is alienated from the garden, and yet what does God tell him? There is coming one who is going to crush the head of the serpent. So in the midst of man's alienation from God, there's God's faithfulness. We see his kindness to Cain. Cain is alienated. He says, people are going to kill me, and God gives him a mark so that he can continue to live. Noah, here's a man who is by himself in a very wicked world, and yet God shows his faithfulness in delivering him. We see the same idea in the narrative cycles. Man is alienated, but God is faithful to his covenant people. So we look at Abraham. So he's alienated from his father's land in the land of Ur. God calls him out. So he's now a stranger and a pilgrim. He's no longer in his land, his father's land. He's being told to go to a land he's never seen before. Goes to the land of Canaan. He goes down to Egypt, and then down to Gerar. He's alienated from the best land by Lot. He has to find a wife for Isaac outside of the promised land. At the end, again, he just has this little plot for a tomb. So he's alienated from the land, and yet he has the promise of God, the land that God has promised to his descendants. Come to Isaac. And if you've ever wondered, why did Isaac only get one chapter when everybody else gets like 10, 12 chapters dedicated to them? The reason is because with the theme of alienation, Isaac was in the land, so he wasn't really alienated from the land. However, if you turn to Genesis 26, you say, what do we see about Isaac? And as we go through chapter 26, we see a very familiar theme, alienation. So he goes to Gerar, Abimelech, the king of the Philistines. The Lord appears to him, says, don't go to Egypt. So he stays there. Isaac lives in Gerar, lies about Rebekah. Abimelech sees him and gets upset because he had lied to him. It says, one of our people might have easily lain with your wife. And so Abimelech has to put a special protection around Isaac. So at the very least, he's alienated from the people of Gerar. But then we come to the second half of the chapter, and there we have this cycle. Here's Isaac. He digs a well. And the people in the area get really upset and say, that's our well. And Isaac moves. And he digs another well. And the people say, that's our well. And he moves again. And he digs another well. And they say, that's our well. And he moves again. And he digs another well. This happens 4 times. What's the theme that's developing? Here's Isaac, who is in the land that God has promised him, and yet he has to keep moving because he's alienated from the very wells he's digging. Come to Jacob, alienated from his family. He has to leave his family, leave his land, work under Laban. Laban mistreats him, and yet through that, the faithfulness of God is revealed because what? He becomes wealthy, and he gets 12 sons who become the progenitors of the tribes of Israel. When we come to Joseph, again, what do we see? Alienation. He's alienated from his family, from the land. He goes down into Egypt, and yet we see that the Lord was with Joseph. So Joseph is alienated, and yet God is faithful. When we come to the end of the story, we have the entire family who has come down to Egypt in chapters 48 to the end of the chapter, chapter 47 through the end of the chapter. They're there, and they're together, and they have this portion of Egypt that they're living in, and yet they're not in the promised land. So they're still alienated from the promised land at the end of the book. Now, just take a minute and think. Put yourself in the original audience. If you are an Israelite and you're traveling through the wilderness, and you have been told there is a promised land that God has given us, and someday we will get it. And you're traveling around and you're subsisting on manna and you're getting water from rocks, and every day is pack up, move, set down, set up. And that's your life. What would you be thinking? I mean, I know what I would be thinking. It's like, if God promised us the land, why are we in the wilderness here? Why do we have to keep doing laps in the desert? Why doesn't God just give us the land? And so when they then come and they read Moses writing the book of Genesis, what they would then see is this theme of alienation in God's people is something that has been true of Abraham, it's been true of Isaac, it's been true of Jacob, it's been true of Joseph. And yet, remember, with all 4 of them, and going back even further, God has always been faithful to his people. Think how encouraging that would be if you're in the desert, alienated from your land, wondering, is God faithful? You have this track record. Yes, God has been faithful over and over and over again. He is not going to start being unfaithful with you. Now, it's in the middle of this then that we see a prefiguring of the gospel. So we're going to take a look and zoom in to Abraham, and we're going to see a prefiguring of the gospel. Now, what is prefiguring? Prefiguring is setting up a pattern that you then see again later. Okay, so it's something that you see, the instances, all these pieces work together in such a way that when you see it again later, you go, wait a minute, I've seen that before. That's okay. Yeah, that's the same theme that was going on back here. That's what we're seeing here. So let's take a look at Abraham. Let's see if we see that here. And one author I was reading describes this as the gospel of Abraham. So what's true of Abraham? Abraham has what? He has the promise of a better land that requires the birth of a son. Genesis chapter 12. What does God say? Go forth from your country, from your relatives, from your father's house to the land I will show you, and I will make you a great nation. What does that require? There must be the birth of a son for this promise to come to pass. So all of God's promises to Abraham hinges on whether or not he has a son. Well, what about this son? Genesis chapter 21. What happens with Sarah? She is past childbearing. She is no longer capable of having a child, and yet God comes and says, about this time next year, you will have a son. Sarah laughs because this is physically impossible, and yet what do we have? We have a miraculous birth of a son. Sarah's past childbearing years, and she has a son that is clearly from divine action. Okay, so the land is predicated on the promise of a son. The son is miraculously born. If we go back to chapter 15, we see God's covenant to Abraham. And he makes this through a unique covenant sacrifice where God makes a sacrifice or takes a sacrifice and uses it to establish a covenant with Abraham, to his covenant people. We come to Genesis 17, and we have the institution of circumcision. What is circumcision? Circumcision initiates a person into the covenant community, says this person is an Israelite. We know that because he has been circumcised. And then it perpetually reminds who you are, what is true about you for the rest of your life, declaring the Israelites' identity. What are some other things that are true about Abraham? Well, we have the alienation of the covenant community. So like we've seen all throughout the book of Genesis, we have God's covenant community that is alienated from the world. They have this land that's supposed to be theirs, and yet they don't quite possess it yet. If we go back to Genesis 15, we have the promise of trials for the covenant community. God tells Abraham, you're going to go down, your descendants are going to go down to Egypt, and they're going to be there for 400 years. But after that, you're going to come out, and they will return here. What else do we have? We have this eschatological hope, this ending hope for the covenant community, for the Israelites, that someday we are going to be a great nation and we are going to possess the land that God has given us. What else? We also have the death of the son. So we have Isaac, who is offered up as a sacrifice. And you look at that, and if you're reading through it for the first time, you ought to go, well, wait a minute. If Isaac dies, if this son dies, the promises fail. And God doesn't fulfill his promises to his people. The covenant is meaningless. And so even as Isaac faces death, we also have a theme of the resurrection of the son. So yes, Isaac wasn't killed. However, he faced death, and it was only the direct act of God that broke the sentence of death that was over him. And because of that, what happens? Genesis 22:16 and 17, the covenant community, the Israelites, receive assurance that they would survive and receive a glorious future. Verses 16 and 17, God says, "By myself I have sworn, declared the Lord, because you have done this thing and have not withheld your son, your only son. Indeed, I will greatly bless you, and I will greatly multiply your seed as the stars of heaven and as the sand which is on the seashore. And your seed shall possess the gate of their enemies." Okay, so you've got all these elements within the life of Abraham that you look at, and now on this side of the cross, we see there's a correspondence, there's a parallel that's being developed. In the wisdom of God, as Moses is writing this down, there's a picture that's being drawn that then when we come to Jesus, we go, wait a minute, I've seen that picture before. That makes sense. Abraham was pointing forward to something. And so we have this theological parallel with then the gospel of Jesus Christ. Because what do we have? We have the promise of a better land that is founded on the birth of a son. John 1:18. As John broaches this issue in the prologue. John 1:14, the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. We saw his glory, the glory as of the only begotten from the Father, full of grace and truth. Hebrews chapter 11 talks about our future better land, and this is all predicated on the birth of a son. What else do we have? Well, we have a miraculous birth of the son, whereas Sarah was past childbearing in Matthew 1, in Luke 1, we have a woman who is a virgin, and she miraculously gives birth. We have a unique covenant sacrifice. Here's Jesus' death, which institutes the new covenant for the redeemed community. Luke 22:20 makes that explicitly clear. When Jesus, and we read this often when we're taking the Lord's table, Jesus took the cup after they had eaten, saying, "This cup which is poured out for you is the new covenant in my blood." So Jesus' death institutes a new covenant for the redeemed community, for the church. We also have a covenant memorial, whereas previously you have the circumcision, which initiates and then reminds. For us, we have what? We have baptism. That is the initiation into the new covenant. This shows this person is a covenant member. Then what do we have? We have the Lord's table, which serves to remind us month after month after month after month, who are we? What else do we have? We have the alienation of the covenant community. We are Christians, so we should be, established in taking over the world and whatever the case may be. No. The Bible's picture is that you're going to be suffering persecution. You're going to be strangers and outcasts. We could look at 1 Peter chapter 1, where Peter refers to the believers as aliens. Why? Because we are strangers in a strange land right now. Along with that, we have the promise of trials for the church that speak of the believers' trials that parallel the promise of 400 years of trial in Egypt. We have, like the Israelites, we have an eschatological hope. They were hoping for Canaan. We are hoping for a greater Canaan. We have the death of the son, Isaac, who faced death. We have Jesus, who likely on the very same mountain faces and experiences death. But then, as with Isaac, Jesus faced death, and only the direct act of God broke the sentence of death over him. And because of that, we have the promise of surviving, that we will live, that we will have a glorious future. And so there's a gospel nested and embedded in the life of Abraham that we then see reflected in the life of Jesus. And as we're reading through Genesis, that ought to be something that stands out. It's like, wait a minute, alienation, and here's elements that rhyme with Jesus, if I could put it that way. And so the theme of Genesis relates to us today. Let's think about the theme of alienation. What's true of believers today? We look at them, we see Abraham, we see Jacob, we see Joseph, and they are not possessing the land. They have the promise, but they're not there yet. Does that relate to us here today? Absolutely. What's true? We are not yet in our land, and yet we have been promised by God that someday there's coming a day when He reigns, and we will, as it were, be in the greater Canaan. So we're still strangers and pilgrims in the world today, just like the patriarchs, just like Israel. And yet God, as He was faithful with them, is going to be faithful with us here and now. Like Abraham, he was called out of Ur and promised a better land. In a very similar way, we have been called out of our land, if we want to call it the land of sin, the city of destruction, as the case may be. And we are promised a better land that we do not yet possess. But we know that this promise has been assured because there is a miraculous birth, there has been a sacrifice, there has been the resurrection of a son who gave us that promise. And so we operate in the hope of a better land, even though we are alienated from that. So as you look at Abraham, promised land, never possessed it. Isaac, who was forced to move from point to point what was rightfully his. We have Jacob, who was estranged from his family and his land. We have Joseph, who lived in exile for nearly all of his life. We can then draw parallels to the fact that we right now are in a type of exile. In this world here, we are strangers and we are aliens, and yet we have the hope of the promise that we are not home yet. We have the promise of a return to a land where we will be in perfect fellowship with God, like Adam and Eve before they were alienated. Someday, all of that is going to be undone. And when we come to the end of the Bible, we see that in Revelation 21 and 22, there's no more curse. All the sin has been removed, and we're now in perfect fellowship with God in the land that He has given us, described throughout chapter 21 and 22. And that is our great hope. We are still waiting for that time when that inheritance is ours. You turn to Hebrews chapter 11. We're going to land here and just make some observations and applications. In Hebrews chapter 11, you see this theme come up. Hebrews chapter 11, verses 1 through, I believe, verse 12. You have a description of what faith is. Faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the evidence and the conviction of things not seen. When you have a promise that is coming, but you have not seen it yet, but you're holding fast to, but God promised, that's faith. And so the author of Hebrews takes us through illustrations of faith. Abel, Enoch, Noah, Abraham, Sarah, as people who were promised something. And then their lives, because of their faith, changed how they lived their lives. Verse 8, by faith Abraham, when he was called, obeyed by going out to a place which he was to receive for an inheritance. And he went out not knowing where he was going. By faith he lived as an alien in the land of promise, as in a foreign land, dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob, fellow heirs of the same promise. For he was looking for the city which has foundations, whose architect and builder is God. He was waiting for the fulfillment of the promise that God was going to give him. We see that. Drop down to verse 13. What is the summary that we see? All these died in faith without receiving the promises. But having seen them and having welcomed them from a distance, and having confessed that they were, here it is, strangers and exiles on the earth. For those who say such things, make it clear that they are seeking a country of their own. And indeed, if they had been thinking that country from which they went out, they would have had opportunity to return. But as it is, they desire a better country, that is a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. What is this saying? Here we have the example that is set out throughout Genesis. I have a promise. I have not seen the promise. I have not experienced the promise. And yet the promise was given to me by God. And because of that, I believe him. And I will continue to believe him all the way up to and including the point of death. That then provides an example for every single one of us who names the name of Jesus Christ, because we have a promise that has been given that you and I have not seen yet. And yet we live in that promise, knowing that when that time comes for us to take our final breath, that we will then be recipients of that which God has promised. So we look at these Old Testament examples. We see their example, and then we can apply that then to how we live. And so we can ask the question, if we're thinking about that, if we are anticipating a future land, how does that impact our lives today? Drop down just a few verses to chapter 12, verses 1 through 3. Therefore, since we have so great a cloud of witnesses surrounding us, pause, that word witnesses is where we get our word martyr, martus. It's the idea of someone who testifies with their lives what they believe is true. Since we have been surrounded by these people who have demonstrated with their lives what they believed was true based on God's promise, what should be true about us? Let us also lay aside every encumbrance and the sin which so easily entangles us. Let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, despising the shame. Could we say, parenthetically, who's alienated from the glory that he rightfully deserved, endured the cross, despising the shame, has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. For consider him who has endured such hostility by sinners against himself, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart. What we see in Abraham, in Jacob, Joseph, in Isaac, in Genesis 1 through 11, the alienation that just pervades the book, in many ways is correspondent to the alienation that Jesus experienced on earth as he's there in the midst of sinners. Because why? He had a greater hope that was promised to him. Abraham had a greater hope that was promised to him. Jacob had a greater hope that was promised to him. Joseph had a greater hope that was promised to him. And we have a greater hope that is promised then to us, which means when you press it down to the nitty-gritty of daily life, what does that mean? If you have that hope of God's promise, you should lay aside sin. You should lay aside the weight that encumbers, and you should run the race that is set before you. Why? Because you have hope of a better land, and your commitment then is going to be with everything in you. I want to run my race well, because that's what I'm focused on, not this life here. We tend very easily, I include myself in this, we tend very easily to construct our lives around the here and now. What I have, my life's meaning, is all wrapped up in what takes place within, what, about a 50-mile radius of here. If that is true, if we are living as if this life is our home, what is going to be true? Answer: that will be a major feeder of sin and taking on the encumbrances and the weights of sin. Think about it. Let's take a few examples. Pornography. What is pornography? My life is about pleasure now, and I'm going to get that pleasure rather than living in anticipation of my future home. Let's take conflict. Just your garden variety. I'm irritable and I'm fighting with my spouse, fighting with my kids, fighting with my brothers and sisters. When you are fighting, you are wanting something. What are you wanting? Whatever you fill in, I promise you, it's not, I want a greater promised land in which I enjoy God forever. I promise you that's not what you're wanting. Instead, it's, well, I want my wife to respect me. Is that too much to ask? She didn't respect me. She didn't appreciate me. My husband didn't appreciate me. My kids don't appreciate me. Do I not deserve X? I ought to. My boss isn't giving it to me. I deserve it. Why does it matter? Because this life is what matters. This life is my home. If you don't give me what I want, you're impacting my home. My home is now shaky and unstable. And so I engage in conflict because I want something right now instead of wanting the greater land that God has promised. Discontent. How prevalent is this? Crummy house, crummy car, crummy job, crummy health. I deserve so much better than this. I ought to have better than this. And I'm not getting better than this. So what? I'm going to engage in self-pity. I'm going to walk around telling people how hurt I am all the time. That's how I'm going to show people that I'm discontent. Are you discontent? It's because functionally you're not living in the light of what you have been promised as a believer. How about trials? What is the temptation when trials come? Is it not to say, Lord, how could you let this happen? I thought you loved me. And instead, look what you have given me. And this is really, really hard. What does that mean? I'm looking at this life as my inheritance. Instead of being a stranger and a pilgrim, this is my home. And God, you have impacted my home. Instead of looking forward to the promise of what is to come. But when we look at Genesis and we see the theme that runs through it, and we compare that to Hebrews, and we look at what God has taught all throughout Scripture, we're reminded what's true. We are strangers and aliens. This is not my home. This is preparation for my home. And so the witnesses, the testifiers who have gone before us, challenge us then to put sin to death, to follow the example of Jesus, to anticipate the greater promise that he has promised to us. When we look at Genesis, what we see in Abraham, to take one example, a picture of the gospel. What happened with Abraham 1,400 years, or 2,000 years, 2,100 years before Christ? That wasn't an accident. When Moses writes about Abraham, it's not just, here's some interesting facts that are interesting about the life of Abraham, which are very interesting facts. And so I'm going to write down these interesting things because people might be interested. Rather, in the wisdom of God, he is superintending what is written down in the inspired text of Scripture so that you read Abraham and you go, and then you come to Jesus and you say, oh, I look at Abraham and, as it were, I think Jesus. Abraham was a living parable, a prefiguring of the gospel. And so you see Abraham, you think Jesus. I don't think it's a stretch to make the application. Should it not be that that is true for us as well? That somebody takes a look at you and they say, what I see when I see Tim living his life is I see Jesus. He reminds me of Jesus. In a very similar way to when we see Abraham, he reminds us of Jesus. So what we have here, the brief time that God has given us, are tools then, not to be used for ourselves, but rather to prepare us for the land that is to come, to fight sin, to put sin to death, to pursue what is most important in the life that is to come. If there are questions about what I've said, I'd be happy to clarify. I hope that this is helpful in at least some regard as we go through this. And then next week we're going to look at another illustration of the gospel. But if you're hearing this and you're going, that's not me, and I need the gospel because I'm not a Christian, then I hope you would talk to me. You talk to Chris or Peter or anybody here. If you're looking at your life and saying, functionally, that's not how I live my life, again, talk to any one of the elders. We would be happy to talk with you. But it's my hope that by God's grace, we would live in anticipation of the promised land, recognizing right now we're strangers and aliens, but for this life only. Let's close in a word of prayer.